topic after we heard some of the challenges to supply chain logistics. Of course, we're all concerned about workforce, but that's a topic that's bigger than a one afternoon discussion. We're very interested in the threat from cyber to transportation logistics, and the thing that we're learning is that there are so many different components of the American economy and American ecosystem. So, for example, if you're the port, you have to deal with state policies, with federal policies, you deal with the Coast Guard. If you're a hospital system, you deal with HIPAA and federal agencies. If you are a power company, you deal with FERC and federal and state and local entities. And how does the state play a role in prophylactically protecting against attacks from critical state infrastructure? Secondarily, during the actual crisis, how do we deal with communications between the various levels of sub-agencies, cities, counties, et cetera, the non-government organizations like AIF, the for-profit private actors, the federal agencies, obviously the FBI, potentially the CIA. What is the plan as we find that is no longer something we can just leave to the federal government to take care of us? It doesn't work for the state. It doesn't work for the private sector anymore when it comes to cybersecurity. So we're going to hear from three gentlemen today at the forefront of developing and executing a response during an emergency, whether it's from a law enforcement angle, whether it's from emergency management services, whether it's for state agency information technology, and we've got a great panel. I'm going to introduce them in reverse order of how I'll ask them to speak, if it's okay. So we'll start with Ryan Locke, who's the Chief of Programs at the Florida Division of Emergency Management. He deals and is the head of the State Emergency Response Team Chief for Florida. As CERT Chief, he oversees operations, logistics, planning, and administration in the State Emergency Operations Center, which, by the way, I spent 9/11 as Speaker of the House in the Emergency Operations Center. Quite an experience. It wasn't designed to handle terrorist attacks, but it served us very well, and interested in hearing from the pandemic perspective and from the cyber perspective, how is the State Emergency Operations Center set to function? Our second speaker will be Special Agent Mike Phillips. He's in charge of the state Special Agent in Charge, otherwise known as SAC. He is with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and he oversees the Office of Statewide Investigative Services. So his job is to find out when something bad happens, who the bad actor was from the state's perspective. He deals not only with cyber high-tech crime, but mutual aid, aviation, child abduction response, missing persons, sex offenders. He came to the state from his position at the Leon County Sheriff's Office, and we're delighted that he has a focus and some expertise in cybercrime. So we're delighted to have the Special Agent Phillips with us today. And then finally, I'm going to ask to sort of lead off with his perspective on where the state's been and his vision as a policymaker, and now as the key Chief Information Officer for the state of Florida, perspective on what the state agencies and state government needs to be focused on and concerned with as we move forward. Jamie Grant leads Florida's digital service. He's a third-generation Floridian. I actually served in the legislature when Jamie's dad was in the Florida Senate. He was appointed a little over a year ago to be the state's Chief Information Officer. He served in the Florida House for 10 years, and he is a graduate of Auburn University, where he has a BS in Business Administration, a minor in Political Science, and also has a Juris Doctorate from Stetson University. So, Jamie, we'd love to hear an update on where you see the state is, what the business community can be doing to help you, and where we are as a state protecting against and then responding to that cyber attack when it occurs on a enterprise-wide perspective.
Thank you, Speaker. It's good to be here. It's good to be in my hometown, even if it's for about 12 hours. So nice to be home. just to give everybody just kind of a quick 35-second overview of what the Florida Digital Service is and perhaps as importantly what it's not. But we really have two business units within the digital service. One is running the state data center. So a subset of state agencies and a subset of state data runs through the state data center. The other business unit is called the Office of the State CIO. And that's where everything that most people care about actually is. Cybersecurity, Office of Data Management, project oversight of technology projects, all rulemaking, standards, and governance comes out of that second bucket. To give you a little bit of a snapshot of what I inherited when I eventually said yes to this appointment, 91% of all appropriated funds went to the state data center, and 82% of all FTEs or employees were in the state data center. Said another way, 9% of appropriations and 18% of employees were left for cybersecurity, data interoperability, data management, and all these other things. And so, as I like to say, I have an impossible job, and I love it. It keeps me fired up every day to know that every day we'll have some impossible task that we have to put ourselves in a room and kind of figure out how we're gonna get there. Speaking specifically, I think on cyber, I'll say just a couple of things that I think are. I'll start with kind of the bad news. Florida's really far behind. The good news is we're so far behind in a lot of ways we're ahead. And where you've seen other states make significant investments in infrastructure over the last 5, 10, 15 years, and whether that's infrastructure on the way that state technology operates, whether it's the actual technological infrastructure, you've seen states go different directions, where I think we actually have in Florida for the first time, and Speaker, I know you know this history all too well, for the first time I think we have an opportunity to succeed in Florida's technology office. To give some of you who aren't familiar with the history, usually the law of bureaucracy says that if government creates it, it lives forever. At least one outlier is Florida's technology office, which has been created for the exact same purpose four different times, abolished 4 different times. So my 5 predecessors are in the graveyard. As I like to tell our team, you can play fast, you can play free, you can play not scared, because the world knows it's a tough task. It's going to be a little bit chaotic. Our job is to structure and organize and get to a place where we can go from kind of launching a startup from within government to actually having an operation and organization where we know exactly what the definition of success is, we know how we measure it, and then how we can work with our counterparts to get there. The reason I think we're in a position to succeed for the first time in the state's history starts with executive backing. Every one of my mentors or friends in the tech space that has worked either aligned to the position I now hold somewhere in the country or had that position somewhere else. I don't care, Republican, Democrat, big state, small state, they'll all tell you, and it's the same thing in the business world, if you don't have the backing of the executive, you can't make real change. And so to me, one of the critical factors in saying yes was the fact that Governor DeSantis was dead set and dead serious on an expectation that this work. Operative, question being, what is this with all of the things underneath our purview? But the executive backing is there. Secondly is legislative backing, policy and money. The state made the largest investment in our state's history into cybersecurity this past year, albeit to reserve, and that's been a hot topic for us to try and navigate during year one as we try and get it set up to get through the hoops necessary to have those funds released by the legislature so that we can start deploying some of those solutions on behalf of the enterprise. But I think you'll be really excited to see what we start doing when we have those funds released to truly create a center of excellence. And then the third is the fact that the technological tools and the leadership exists to run a center of excellence. And the reason I stress this is if you look back in the history at the 4 predecessors or really any other case study in leadership, I think it's fair to say that the predecessors to the Florida Digital Service all kind of either chose anarchy or monarchy, right? They chose some semblance of no governance, no structure, and just let the agencies run wild. And so when the agencies ran wild, even if they were all doing different versions of smart things, they were all doing different things with no standards. And if we're really going to get to a place of interoperability, and I don't just mean API calls, I mean the ability for for us to interoperably operate in the middle of a prospective cyber crime, right? Where is the line between cybersecurity and an investigation that our friends at FDLE, where does that handoff happen, and how do we give our friends at FDLE everything that helps them from an operational perspective get to the root cause of what we're dealing with as quickly as possible, or in the event that we have to actually spin up emergency management and our role now with our friends at DEM. How do we operate inside the EOC? As Ryan and I were joking a little bit waiting to come up here, I got a crash course in that during COVID, where we had to do some support on the vaccine initiative, and I very quickly realized that we have different operations, different cultures, different approaches, and our job is to figure out how to mesh inside of the EOC to give our friends in emergency management kind of what they need. And so I'll maybe close here, Speaker. I think the future is really bright. I think that if we can kind of continue building the plane as it flies, and drown out some of the noise that sometimes that can have an impact on you. I think that we're on the precipice of doing some really, really cool stuff in Florida. And here's a couple things I'd say to your point, Speaker, about how we can collectively help. Number one, I've said as a digital service, we're going to be really clear what we do and what we don't do. I'm going to be really clear that if you come to us and say, hey, I want to sell you this thing, I'm going to try and get you to understand that no and not yet are very different answers. Not yet is not a bad answer. It just means I don't have an employee yet that can actually work with you to get that from concept to live, and I'm not going to say yes until I can do my job to make sure that an implementation meets the expectations of your CEO and of my team's CEO. And so really trying to be disciplined to say, hey, where are we moving, and what is it that we do and not do. And then the other thing I'd maybe leave as a charge here, because we could talk for days and hopefully some good questions, demystifying technology. I am now finding agencies that are actually trying to hire what I call translators to interface with our team, right? Like, it is so broken from a communications perspective that the recipient of communication is saying, I need to hire a translator to ingest what you're describing. If we are enterprise technology, whether it's on the data front, whether it's on the cybersecurity front, or anything in between, my team's been through some painful exercises, and I explained to them that a cybersecurity briefing has to be understood by my mom. And if Beverly Grant doesn't understand the cybersecurity briefing, then go back to the drawing board because it doesn't work. And that's a tough process. With that said, we've had an amazing team that's kind of left us continually being impressed. Because at the end of the day, technology isn't anything different than baseline operations. The hammer and the wheel were at one point fundamental innovation and transformational technology. Cybersecurity is no different, and we have to learn to quit talking about it differently, because it's really nothing more than physical security, right? When I have people tell me, I don't have time to learn cybersecurity, the first question I ask them is, okay, if we just stepped out of digital and we said, how would you secure this building? All of a sudden, people start to go, well, wait a minute, there's some baseline things I'd want to know. I'd want to know what assets I have, what assets I don't have, what assets am I supposed to protect, what assets are not my responsibility to protect, where are vulnerabilities, what's happening on the end of the range. And so all of those just kind of fundamental questions, I think we really are in a great place. It's a matter of being able to get off the ground and to start showing traction, because change is hard. And as I have learned, it is far easier to launch a startup in the private sector than to launch a startup within government, because in both scenarios you have no resources, but in the private sector you don't have all the constraining rules. You don't have bureaucracy that can strangle you. And so we continue to kind of work every day to try and get through that. But I would just stress, in large part because of our friends, the relationships, understanding what the landscape is, I think it's a really bright day for the future of cybersecurity in Florida. It's also kind of the birthing of something that I think can be really special, and if done right, has alliances with the private sector, has alliances with local government and with federal government, because, and I'll close here, the threat actor doesn't understand separations of power. The threat actor doesn't care about branches of government. Government does. And so getting people to understand that this isn't a local issue, or this isn't a jurisdictional issue, or this isn't a constitutional issue, while nothing inside of the solution would or should violate the Constitution, this is not something, this is a war. It is an all-out war where our threat actors, the adversaries, seek to cripple us. And we have to understand that a lot of the baseline territorial food fights don't apply. Because an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint, whether the local government owns it, whether I own it, or whether the federal government owns it. And so we look forward to building that coalition with both the public and private sectors across all sides of it to build the pipeline of talent and to simultaneously demonstrate how quickly we can exponentially harden the state sitting.
Well, that is a great overview, and one of the very important agencies in the state of Florida happens to be the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. But Agent Phillips, you bring a special expertise into cyber. So your thoughts on where we are, how we can be bringing those different actors that Jamie referred to, and what you see as FDLE's role, what you expect from the private sector, what you're hoping for, and how we can be better prepared as a state for whatever happens next.
So to catch up to the speed at which CIO Grant goes, give me just a second to get on the on-ramp, and I'm going to try to speed up and catch up with him. 20 years ago, I was one of the first agents that was in the Florida Computer Crime Center. And I remember the first case I worked that was a hacker in Miami. And when we finally hit the house with a search warrant about 5 o'clock in the morning, we found a 15-year-old laying there with in his boxers, passed out on the bed. He's got 3 monitors, which was just bizarre to us at that time. I know now it's commonplace. And he's laying there passed out, and there's nothing but code all over the screen. And I'm like, this is my suspect, a 15-year-old? Yes, that was. And now, as we saw from the demonstration here, you know, our suspects now are state-sponsored. They're large groups. There's multiple enterprises. It's a massive undertaking for us in law enforcement to take this on. I'm glad to say that FDLE has grown. We no longer have just one center. We have 7 squads around the state. And then we have an 8th squad, which is underneath me at the headquarters. And we have somewhere around 60 to 70 employees. Those employees are made up of sworn law enforcement, then forensic digital consultants, which are our smartest, most talented in the digital world. Those folks, we do our best. I try to offer them as many, Pizza Fridays and everything else to keep them, but we lose them quite often, as we discussed here earlier today. And then we have the analytical-minded folks who help us keep up with all the data and the suspect information. And that 3 kind of person team is what we use as the basis and foundation for all of our incident response. And as represented kind of here, that triad, it grows and multiplies depending on the size of the event. We have partnered with FBI. We're in all their joint terrorism task forces and where all their cyber squads are in the state. We have agents that are there. We work very closely with them. As part of the presidential directives, we work very closely with Homeland Security, who's actually here in the room, one of their representatives, and we share information with them. And I will tell you that of the 3 parts that make up the beginning of our mission, whether that be for FDLE or from the Domestic Security Oversight Council, which Speaker Feeney just talked about, was created right after 9/11. That group is we want to detect, prevent, and defend any types of crime. And in the cyber world, we spend more time wanting to prevent it from happening. I'm so happy to see the people that are represented here, because our goal is to make Florida a safer place, both physically and in the information technology world, so that you all can conduct business and make money. It's just kind of how that circle of evolution works. And that is our mission, is if we can make this state safer than any other state, then we're going to attract those types of businesses, and that's what we want to do. And in order to do that, we have to partner with you. And we have lots of partnerships. Some are not at a cost, but many of them are at a cost. We share intelligence. We have a lot of different relationships with the business community that help share that intel with us. Listen to the speaker earlier talk about the cyber insurance. When I first heard that come out, I'm like, who in the world wants to have insurance against ransomware and those types of events? Spend your money in trying to prevent it. But then sitting here listening to it, I see the business side of it that actually does and accomplishes the same task that I've been trying to do for 20 years. And that's to get businesses to spend money up front on security, do the things that they should, the basic hygiene things that they should be doing to make their businesses more safe. I'll pause right there, but I think FDLE is in a great spot, and we will continue in this effort.
Well, that's a great point on insurance. I never would have had a fire extinguisher hanging around my house or alarm systems if it hadn't been the fact that my home insurance, saves me 30% annually if I meet certain check boxes. And so sometimes you need the carrot and stick. Although I represent the business community, we don't want the stick. We want the carrot. So with that, Ryan comes to us from the Department of Emergency Management. And I'm actually going to introduce Ryan. He's the Chief Programs at the Florida Division of Emergency Management and State Emergency Response Team Chief for our state. But I'm actually going to throw out a question, and I've got some for Jamie and for and Mike in a bit as you give your presentation, Ryan. So we've just experienced a pandemic that 18 months ago, 2 years ago, none of us anticipated, none of us were prepared for. That means policymakers, nonprofits, for-profits, feds, locals. And there are lessons to be learned from that pandemic. Florida does hurricane response really well because we got lots of experience. If we're the best at it in the world, we have to be. Kind of like Israel does security better than anybody. They don't have a choice. And so, Ryan, I'll ask you as you talk a little bit about the big picture from Emergency Management Services perspective and cyber, also how you think that a pandemic threat to the business community writ large is similar or different than what we could expect with a state-sponsored coordinated cyber attack.
No, thank you, sir. And so, emergency management, you guys may think, why am I up here, right? Very often in the state of Florida, emergency management is thought of as the hurricane guys. And, it's not the case. Emergency management really three things. First, it's all hazards. Now, all hazards is a buzzword that came around from FEMA, about 10 years ago. It doesn't mean that you have a plan for every hazard. It's a big misconception, even within the emergency management industry. All hazards means that you set up a system of response, protection, prevention, mitigation, and recovery that can be applied to the entire set of hazards. It doesn't matter if it's a hurricane, if it's a train derailment, if it's a cyber incident. You set up a system that is tried, practiced, and tested so it can respond to no matter what that hazard is. And where that comes into play is, as the sir said, the state EOC wasn't built for a terrorist attack, but the system was in place that could handle it. The state EOC wasn't built for a pandemic, as these gentlemen could contest to, but the system in place was a system that was used. And so, today we're talking about cybersecurity. The state EOC was not built to handle cybersecurity incidents or a black sky type cybersecurity incident, but the system in place is the same system that would be used. So while thankfully we haven't been able to test a cyber incident on a large scale in Florida, the system has been tested through every hurricane that we've had, for the pandemic that we've had, and for the nuclear power plant incidents down to every space launch that they take off at Cape Canaveral. The system is practiced. And so the second thing that emergency management is consequence management. There's really two sides of any kind of disaster. There's the crisis management and there's the consequence management. FDLE and the cyber response professionals, they handle the crisis. There's a bad actor, they need to be prevented, they need to be mitigated, and that situation needs to be contained. But every disaster has consequences, and those consequences, just like the system, is all hazards. You talk about a black sky event or even a smaller event, Colonial Pipeline. Throughout the Colonial Pipeline incident, there was never a shortage of fuel in Florida that was caused by the pipeline incident. What caused the shortage of fuel in Florida was the panic buying and everyone going out to the gas station and saying that we need to buy the fuel now so that there's no shortage. But that caused a shortage because of the in-the-moment system that our economy has. So that fuel shortage also happens every time there's a hurricane. There's never a shortage of fuel pre-hurricane, but everyone that has 3/4 of a tank decides they need a full tank before they drive 1 hour to their shelter. That causes a shortage. Just supply chain at the grocery store, same exact thing. You guys all remember in the early stages of the pandemic, you try to buy a roll of toilet paper, it didn't happen. Try to go buy a bottle of water before a hurricane, the same situation happens. kind of going to the question about what we saw in the pandemic and how there are some similarities to a cyber incident, that's kind of what we're going to see, right? I mean, no matter what the incident is, there's always going to be a perception from the public on what does that mean for them. And as Jamie Graham was talking about what a cyber briefing needs to be able to understood by the grandmother, it also needs to be understood by the private citizen sitting at their home only looking at the tweet that comes out where we talk to them about what they need to do, because they're going to react. And so just how we have a shortage of toilet paper, just as we have a shortage of water bottle, if it's going to be a cyber incident against a petroleum pipeline, there's going to be a gas shortage. If it's going to be against a cannery, there's going to be shortage of soup. If it's going to be something on a port, just like you said, the manufacturing, the petroleum, all that is cascading impacts that we can see. And that's what the state DOC, when I say consequence management, is what we're looking at. How do we identify those consequences of the incident that rolls over? And that's usually in safety and security, it's housing, it's the community lifelines, they call it, everything from transportation to medical. The third thing emergency management is a collaboration of systems. Emergency management, we're not subject matter experts in anything. Our skill set is trying to bring the right partners together into a single room, which is the State Emergency Operations Center, and trying in a all-hazard system approach those consequences and bring the right resources to the table and the right people to the table. Something people like to...
Ryan, if I can interrupt, for people that haven't been there, and that's most of the state, can you describe the Emergency Management Operations Center and what happens there? So my first introduction, I was Speaker of the House, and of course 9/11 occurred, and I was whisked over there. And in terms of the impact that you don't anticipate, one of my contributions today under Governor Bush was we were getting reports from all over the state, including the business that was doing the best business. It wasn't the people selling toilet papers or water bottles. It was the gun shops. They were going crazy. The FBI is represented there, FDLE, we have non-government, but you can describe the Emergency Operations Center, which was built for hurricanes. But I do remember telling Jeb about mid-afternoon, we had gotten wind that some of the major banks were going to shut down at around noon or 12:30 as a safety accommodation to their employees. Can you imagine what would have happened in Florida during a 9/11 attack on our national assets and the banks shutting down, and then if we would have had an attack at the Space Center or at the Capitol or at Miami or the theme parks? So maybe you can describe real quickly the Emergency Ops Center, because I assume it could be vital during a massive cyber attack. It's been since 9/11 since I was there. So.
100%. The building hasn't changed. We were state-of-the-art building 40 years ago, and we're still in the same building. But the state DOC's perspective, including the conference rooms and what we call breakout rooms, are about the size of this floor up here at the Port of Tampa. The idea is that you're able to bring representatives from every state agency and specific special industry partners into a single room that can coordinate on an incident. So you have a main floor, and in the main floor is divided by operations, planning, logistics, and finance, and then recovery. Again, how do you get reimbursement from the federal government? We've broken up into what's called emergency support functions. You're going to hear a little bit more about that. There's traditionally been 18. Again, it's divided up into what we'd call emergency services. So the boots and the bells, people deploying into a fire or a law enforcement incident or a USAR team. Infrastructure, so everything from roads, power lines, and then human services, the human goods, the mass care, the sheltering, the feeding. Every partner that has a role in any way, shape, or form in any of those three areas are in the state EOC. Again, that's every state agency. Some state agencies are represented with multiple liaisons. And what they do is they bring the resources of their agency and their coordination with their local partners in the counties that can then deploy those resources out to the field. This Division of Emergency Management, we don't have any fire trucks. We don't have any aircraft. We don't have any really deployable personnel besides maybe some technical specialists. All the resources you see from a hurricane come from a different agency or from a private vendor. So the state EOC serves as that nexus where all those individuals can go ahead and decide, again, what's the gap, what resource can meet that gap, and who can we get to find and procure that gap, that resource to fill that gap.
And Jamie, that leads me to a question for you. So we have this physical geographic building that was ideal for dealing with hurricanes, and it turned out it was very useful during 9/11 to stay on top minute by minute from around the state. Every little city all had access into this nerve center. How do we put that into a virtual reality of cyber protocols during an emergency? Because not that you have an answer, but if anybody does, you do.
Well, thank you for the confidence. I think one thing to keep in mind is whether or not we're talking left of boom or right of boom, right? Whether it's cyber insurance, whether it's the EOC, anything we're doing, to me, the delineation becomes from, how do we quit having houses burned down? Is it because we have a ton of firefighters who can respond when a fire starts, or that we perhaps stop building houses with exposed electrical wires and wood frames? And so I think when you look at firefighting quite literally 100 and something years ago, it's an interesting parallel to figure out where the balance is between getting left of boom as much as possible. So I would argue that cybersecurity for the state of Florida starts first with the procurement of anything that touches the state network. I would argue that cybersecurity starts first with the procurement of any operational technology, right? Getting people to stop saying IT. Because when we start thinking about the access to the state network, and I use the state network as kind of a broad term, not just My Florida Network, but when you think about where a point of entry for a threat actor could come, it's no longer just information technology, it's now operational technology, it's now devices that we're putting in our homes, it's devices we're putting in our workspace. So I say that to say a lot of the answers, and maybe kind of going back to, a lot of the answers are found historically by saying, look, what preventative measures can we take to first stop the amount of water that's coming over the boat? And then two, once we've stopped new water coming in the boat, we'll start bailing the water that's out of the boat, and we'll react to something that hops in front of us. The good news, and working with our friends at Emergency Management, really their lead, and we're kind of following, it is true that we are in a state-of-the-art building from 40 years ago. It's also true that the governor asked for, the legislature funded a new emergency management facility for the state that the 15th largest economy in the world can actually do resiliency in. And I think to really kind of touching on everything Ryan said, summing here, the modern day version of resiliency is different than resiliency was 40 years ago. The modern day answer to hardening infrastructure looks and feels different today than it did 40 years ago, but the principles haven't changed. The same principles of what do I have, where does it move, who owns it, who has access to it, where is it vulnerable, how do I monitor it, all of those things, again, to go back, are true of law enforcement 150, 200 years ago if I was in the physical security of a principal, the same way they are today in a digital landscape, of course with the significant difference that the threat landscape is exponentially larger than just the physical proximity to my principal here, and it exponentially continues to expand. Again, the good news is that the state continues to make the investments that are necessary, because the new EOC not only has a ton of improvements for our friends on the law enforcement side, not only gives our emergency management friends a facility that makes a lot more sense, because if I was to sum up my experience in the EOC during vaccines, it's a sardine can and a challenge to operate. It also includes a cyber command component. So building off of, and Ryan I think was going to get here, ESF 20 is now cyber command. So now sitting on the floor of the Emergency Operations Center is a cyber command that directly interfaces between emergency management, my organization, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. I think representing, quite frankly, and Mike, I think you can speak to this a lot better, the lack of communication that has historically happened. I think if you ask me, one of the things I'm most proud of in the first year of trying to stand this thing up, and all the challenges and budgets and operational work plans and all the administrative stuff we have to go through to get a state SOC stood up, it's the fact that we now have the right people at the table talking, and in a way that's not combative, it's not territorial, it's not this is mine, it's collectively getting together saying we have a mission collectively. How do you do what you're best at? How do I do what I'm best at? How does Ryan do what he's best at? And maintain consistency to what the legislative requirements are. I think the manifestation of that, whether it's ESF 20 in the existing operations center, or it's an actual representation of a cyber command in a future operations center, I think is a manifestation of all the hard work that people have done long before I got here.
And that leads into two questions for Mike. And so, Mike, your thoughts on Jamie's perspective of how it's important for agencies to be prepared to communicate. Communications are different theoretically after a cyber attack than they are after, say, a 9/11 type attack or a pandemic. And I imagine communications are something you guys worry about during crises all the time because you have to have an immediate network and response. And the second thing Jamie raised was how the principles of dealing with threats haven't changed, but the technology has changed a lot, and the speed at which we have to react. So the second question for you, Mike, is, okay, I'm a small to mid-sized business. I do business near the port. I buy some stuff that probably comes through the port, but I'm not a customer of the port. I'm not a big shipping company. I'm not a huge importer or exporter directly. I use the supply chain. I am subject to a cyber attack, which simultaneously I'm understanding is impacting other industries. I've got literally 0 seconds to respond. Who's the first call I make? Is it the FBI? Is it to Agent Phillips? Is it to Jamie?
Not it.
So I'll hit the second one first. I should be like a politician and dodge it till the end. I would tell you in the state of Florida, call the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And I'll tell you why. We're represented physically right here. There's 7 regions. There's a regional office just a few miles away. You're going to get a person here. But better yet, we are tied in with the FBI. We have agents sitting at their Joint Terrorism Task Force. We have DHS sitting with us. So if you call us, I promise you, we're going to be calling them right away. Especially if your connections to the supply chain and it's got national or international connections, we're going to be working with them. So that's actually an easy one. But you could call any of us and whoever it is that you have on speed dial, and we'll be responding to you quickly.
One get me anywhere if I can't remember people?
Probably not.
Okay.
Probably. It gets the attention of somebody, but then you got to kind of work through the network. So one of the things I do say in that area is to build those relationships now. Here locally, I'm sure there's an InfraGard group that's active. There's other law enforcement associations and business associations. Start building those connections, because what you do want to do is be able to call somebody direct and ask for agent whoever that you work with quite often. But then the other part that you talked about, in law enforcement, emergency management, incident command structure is a foundation that we've had for many, many years. After 9/11, I think it got better. We exercise it a lot more in the state of Florida because of hurricanes. And what it does is what Jamie was just talking about, which is it gets representatives from various areas in the room together around the round table, cuts out all the outside noise, all the white noise, and focuses on what needs to be decided right now. Helps us rank our priorities as far as what we need to do. And I see a cyber incident, a future cyber incident, being the same thing. We've experienced loss of communication during Hurricane Michael. I can tell you, we're just an hour from anywhere on the coast, and all those law enforcement agencies there, they were dark to us. We had 0 communication with them. The way I was able to talk to a couple of the agencies was really with shortwave radio. It was old ham operators who were talking to some of our operators in the state EOC. Since that time, we're coming up with technologies now that we can either use satellite or some other system when we know that our landline phones, our cellular networks, they're going down when a hurricane hits. So we know that in a cyber incident, whether it's a denial of service attack or whatever the attack is, and they cut out communication, we're going to have a second means of communicating. So just about every backup system we have, as you have said several times a day, we have a plan B through about E for the means of communication, whether that's multiple carriers, whether that's multiple technologies, or what have you. And I would say the same thing goes for a cyber incident. In a critical incident like this, is we're going to have other means of communicating so that we can all sit at the table and talk.
So, and I joke about not in, but maybe the Venn diagram between the 3 of us up here, they respond to any crime in the state of Florida, right? Like in some capacity, it may be interfacing with local law enforcement, but if it is a crime within the state of Florida, then the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is a relevant organization. If it is an emergency within the state of Florida, then as we sit here, and historically true of both, emergency management is relevant to that. Why I think ESF 20 is so significant is that if it is a cyber incident in the state of Florida, my team, whether today or even in concept as we stand up the state's first true security operations center, may or may not be relevant, right? Like it may or may not be an asset that we help manage, that we have insights to, or have any ability to do anything other than show up and reinforce from a subject matter expertise, right? So just because it's a cyber incident in the state of Florida does not mean that my team either we should have subject matter expertise, but it doesn't mean that we have anything to offer right off the start, because if it's a truly private business and the cyber incident has nothing to do with state asset or whether the network or entity or otherwise, then really we should just be there in a support function to be able to tell these guys, maybe it's the BS meter in some regards in there, but it's not necessarily to come and say, hey guys, here's what the situational report is. On the flip side, if it is a state agency that's been ransomed, if it is a DDoS against government, if it is a fraudulent transfer of funds or any of these other situations that deals with a state agency, then we have to be prepared to show up and say, guys, here's exactly what we have. And I think that's why the communication and the trust and the collaboration is so important. There's situations where I'm going to come in blind, and there's situations where they're going to come in blind. But collectively, they have to deal with every emergency in the state, they have to deal with every crime potentially in the state, and we have to be able to support any cyber incident in the state, whether or not it's a state asset or a state asset is even impacted. And when we say state asset, I mean an entity of state government, not a private business that is domiciled in Florida.
Yep. Well, and you think of all the different industry lines that have to scramble when that attack comes. So all the healthcare emergency operations centers are going to have to respond to that. All of the banks and all of the GPS, transportation, logistics all become a challenge. And making sure we have a communications component, Agent Phillips is just really important, that will survive the attack and help build up and respond to wherever our weaknesses. I don't know if we have a question or two. We're going to move to our Coast Guard panel to sort of be the last substantive panel, but you've got 3 different agencies of the state represented here, and for the first time really in the last few years we've started developing protocols and responses, and these are 3 key leaders in terms of whether Florida is relatively prepared. You're never completely prepared. And are any of you aware of any other state that is really robust in its planning and response and ahead of Florida? Because I'm not.
So we're not the first. This idea of co-locating the cyber command into the EOC, we're definitely not the last. We're probably within the first 5 or 6. Connecticut started a very basic plan, and that's kind of what we kind of looked at the front. Colorado, they learned from experience. By a fairly substantial cyber attack on their DOT, their DOT. And so Connecticut and Colorado have some good experiences. I believe it was New Mexico and Arizona, they had actual attacks. But nationally, this is a big priority for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Homeland Security. So Florida is probably maybe a year ahead of the massive pack of states behind us in terms of the planning, but we're really not that far ahead. So
I'm going to give a different perspective in this regard. I actually just got back from my first trip to the National Association of State CIOs, which if I've ever not fit in it was a great time, sir. If I've ever not fit into a peer group, let me tell you. When you've seen one state's approach to state technology, you have seen exactly one state's approach to state technology. So one of the things that I found actually very valuable out of those few days was being able to talk to colleagues about what they have as a responsibility and what they don't have, right? So if I take you back to where I started and the appropriations that are in the state data center, fundamental question, should the state be in the business of running a state data center? I've said publicly, I think it's not a secret, no. The question is how to get there, but the opportunity cost, the operational cost, And the reason we should be out of that business is it's very easy for us to have some sort of managed services or partnership with the private sector that can do it better, faster, cheaper, where we set the governance restrictions, we can ensure security minimums are met, we can incentivize a no ceilings environment to perpetually chase security. But if we took that part of our operation, where I think Florida, and I'll go back to the legislative backing, the executive backing, and the technical tools that exist, there's not another state that from an enterprise approach actually has an Office of Data Management reporting to the same person as a state CISO would. And so I liken it to an offensive and a defensive coordinator. My state chief data officer should be my offensive coordinator, building innovative solutions, making sure that the government works better, that we transform the way services are delivered. My state CISO should be my defensive coordinator, right? But the fact that those two are inside of the exact same organization, and then third, a direct report that has project oversight and procurement governance, now gives us a little bit of something in Florida that nobody else has. The ability to govern from a centralized office serving as a center of excellence, govern how we procure, what the baselines, standards, what that looks like. The state has never had an enterprise architecture that's an actual enterprise architecture. We're in the middle of finalizing that rulemaking right now. But to be able to start at procurement and then go through how we build, what we build, why we build, or perhaps getting government out of the business of building and leaning more on private sector experience, aligned to securing it, now gives us, I think, a straight line where one organization has the ability to set standards on what we buy, standards on how we implement that, standards on how we protect it, and then, to Ryan's point, ahead of the curve such that if something happened dealing with a state asset, we're not playing the telephone game across 30 some odd agencies.
Well, yes, sir.
Yes, and they are. It's more or less, there's no magic to it. It's just having multiple means, whether it be satellite, multiple carriers. We're not married to just one carrier on the cellular side. And then when it comes to hardwire internet, using multiple lines. That is the way we do it, and having that readily available. Some of our deployable equipment that we have actually has those into the box. So it just fails over. We love hardline connections, but if that line goes down, the system just automatically switches over to a cellular carrier, which is usually faster. And then if that carrier's down, the next one, and then to satellite. I think radio is another means, a little bit slower means, but that's how we have it. The more methods, the more ways, it's just usually the attack vector is not singular. It would have to be, at least 4-plex or larger.
Yeah, maybe we get some tax credits for people that want to raise carrier pigeons as a backup scenario, just in case. Yeah, one more. I bet everybody wants to take responsibility for that problem. That's been around for a while. I was Speaker of the House, I don't know, decades ago. But that is an interesting question. And to the extent, I don't think any of these gentlemen are going to want to take full responsibility for what is...
It's settled.
Yes.
I mean, in some regards, at least slurs is what we're... Mike, if you want to take it just real quick, just so... for those who have been living it a decade or longer, I'll take the endpoint part if you want, but slurs is at least moving.
System, the state law enforcement radio system, slurs as we refer to it, There was recently just a funding award that was given, and that is going to put everybody in the state agencies on the same radio network, which is huge, and bring us up to the latest technology for radios. There is one little technical piece that takes a little bit of time, and that is in the scenario you're talking about in a pursuit. If Tampa PD leaves here and starts traveling out of their county, going to other jurisdictions, if there was a highway patrolman that was involved in that pursuit, then that highway patrolman would stay on the same network until the pursuit ended. But the city officer or county officer would have to start working through patches. And at the speed of a pursuit, that's still a little bit of a difficulty. When it comes to emergency response and it's an incident, whether it be a hurricane or if there was a cyber incident and we all came here, then the Emergency Operations Center, they have various technologies that we can bring in and patch those systems together.
I'll just leave you with this on the endpoints question because it's a good question. When we talk about principles, if you've never read the book Innovative State, I'll make a plug for a good friend, Anish Chopra, who was first CTO of the federal government. But Anish would talk often about the Baltimore City fires at the turn of the century. And Baltimore burned to the ground despite the fact that there were enough firefighters, fire trucks, water, hoses, everything you needed. There just wasn't a standard hookup for a hose to a hydrant. And so people watched a city burn. The issue of standards is the same reason, right? The same reason Baltimore burned is the same reason we have to deal with slurs. You have all these jurisdictions doing their own thing, and there is no standard. So what we've said from my organization with the enterprise architecture is to start with procurement at the very baseline that is industry agnostic, that is technology agnostic. Nobody can show up and say, yeah, but CGIS or HIPAA or DIPA or FERPA or anything else. They show up, and if it's a technology procurement in excess of $100,000, then they have to hit the deliverables in each of the domains that are intended to create a standardization so that we don't have to pick vendors and say, this vendor gets everything or that vendor gets everything. We've just instead said in the event of, let's say, law enforcement radios, everybody has to adopt the same standards. Now go do that. Had the standards been in place at the beginning, you would not have the situation you had. Concluding with endpoints, this is an example of where the state is so far behind, we're actually ahead. The deployments that we will make over the next couple of years on asset inventory and endpoint identification and then subsequently endpoint protection, there's not a lot of work that's been done. And so while that leaves my team with no training manual, with no instructions and constantly, all these different snipe hunts and wild goose chases, the good news is we're not tearing down anybody's work. Right? We can come in with a fresh start and say, hey, here's how we're going to identify every asset on the state network. We're about to do it. Here's how we're going to start protecting endpoints. Here's how we're going to evolve and become more sophisticated with the way that we protect endpoints. And then here's how we do vulnerability management with what we're learning. And now once we've kind of got that baseline set up, how do we work with these friends on kind of both sides of the equation to say, what does it look like for us to start investing in threat intel to actually start identifying some of this stuff so that it's not necessarily a response to an attack, but it may be a prevention of something that would have been an attack. It all comes back to standards. If it doesn't start at standards, we're just going to watch another example of law enforcement radios play out, but on a much grander scale and with much higher stakes.
Join me in thanking Agent Phillips, CIO Grant, Ryan Locke for Department of Management Services. We're really grateful, and we're especially grateful at AIF and all of our members that the state has started to think through these things because we want to be of help. The business community wants to be there to be supportive. We think that security from an IT perspective is important not only for state agencies and from a law enforcement perspective, but it's important to attract new businesses here. We want to be known as having the best protocols available to deal with what looks more inevitable than a potential problem. And so the fact that the state is thinking through this is great. And we're going to lead into the final panel of the day.